Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome to Reading Carl Schmitt. Today, new series on Reading Carl Schmitt will focus on his book on parliamentarism, which is in English translation. I don't even give the title of the video is Parlamentarism, which is the actual title is much bigger, big title and a weird thing. Um, the translation of it is the Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. So let's look at this. And in his preface, today we're going to look at the preface of the second edition, published in 1926, on the contradiction between parliamentarism and democracy. So let's go look at this. So, the second edition of this examination of intellectual circumstances of contemporary parliamentarianism remains essentially unchanged. This should not create the impression that I wish to lift it above any discussion. There are rather grounds for a somewhat contrary fear. A common factual debate about the distance between that distance itself from an all-party political exploration and serve as propaganda for no one might appear impractical, naive, and anachronistic to most people today. It is thus to be feared that an objective discussion of political concepts will arouse scant interest, and the desire for such debate will meet with little understanding. Perhaps the age of discussion is coming to an end after all. The bourgeois age is coming to a discussion after all. When the first edition of this treatise appeared in the summer of 1923, it was generally received in such a way as to confirm these pessimistic conjectures, at least in this modest case. Right? Nevertheless, it would be unjust to ignore specific examples of objective criticism, and the detailed and thoughtful review of such a leading jurist as Richard Thomas, in particular, deserves an exhaustive reply. And he puts them at the end. Now he's going to reply to it. This is the Thomas review is an appendix at the end. Um, um, uh, the utterly fantastic political aims that Thoma imputes to me at the end of his review, I may surely be allowed to pass over in silence. Political combinations aside, his objective arguments concern my identification of the intellectual bias of parliamentarianism is in an outmoded system of thought, because I regard discussion and openness as the essential principles of Parliament. Something of the sort may perhaps have been the definitive conception a few generations ago, but Parliament today has, for a long time, stood on a completely different foundation. In other words, the argument is debate. The purpose of the Parliament was debate. The original purpose of discussion, debate. The Parliament was an instrument of debate, and that was for discussion, deliberation, right? Well, today it's not about debate; it's about legitimization. I think, in that sense. Of, that belief in openness is going to appear today as outmoded as is also my fear. But it must be, but it must then be asked: what sort of arguments or convictions are these which have given a new intellectual foundation to parliamentarianism? Naturally, institutions, like people's ideas, change in the course of time. But I do not see where contemporary parliamentarians could find a new intellectual foundation if the principles of discussion and openness are really inapplicable, or how the truth and justice of parliamentarians could still be so evident. Like every institution, parliaments presuppose a certain characteristic ideas. Whoever wants to find out what these are will be forced to return to Burke, Bentham, Guyot, the French thinker, and John Stuart Mill. He will then, Burke on his thing of Burke generally writings about this, but a letter to Bristol Bentham, his book on legislation, Goroy on, I think, again, a book on representative government, and John Stuart Mill, again, on representative government, right? It, he will then be forced to admit that after them, about since 1848, there have been certainly many new practical considerations, but no new principled arguments. In the last century, one scarcely noticed this because parliamentarism advanced at the same time and in a closest alliance with democracy, without either of them being carefully distinguished from one another. So they came together. In other words, this is argument, representation, the question of representation, parliamentarism, representation, about debate, about deliberation. But after 1848, the whole thing has been no new arguments from it. But then parliamentarianism and quote unquote democracy were close allies. They went hand in hand, he says, alliance, without either of them being carefully distinguished from the other. But today, after their common victory, the difference manifests itself in the distinction between liberal parliamentary ideas and mass democratic ideas cannot remain unnoticed any longer. So this distinction between liberal parliamentary ideas and mass democratic ideas, there is a distinction. The common victory now, the difference is now manifest, right? He says. Therefore, one has to concern oneself with those moldy grades, as Thomas put it, because what is specific to parliamentarism can only be gleaned from their thought. And only there does Parliament retain the particular character of a specific founded institution that can demonstrate its intellectual superiority to direct democracy, as well as Bolshevism and fascism. In other words, it's about direct democracy, about intellectual supremacy. Only by turning to Burke and Goyors and Mill, Bentham and Mill, you get an argument for parliamentary, and this is their supremacy to direct democracy. But there were not only direct democracies, but there's also Bolshevism and fascism. And this is interesting, that Bolshevism and fascism is like direct democracy in that sense. The will of the people, right? That the parliamentary enterprise today is the lesser evil, that it will continue to be preferable to Bolshevism and dictatorship, that it would have unforeseeable consequences were it to be disregarded, that it is socially and technically a very practical thing. All these things are interesting and in part are also correct observations, but they do not constitute the intellectual foundation of a specifically intended institution. In other words, all these things are justification. Okay, yes, that it's better than everything he just gave. Is like, okay, this is true, but that's not justification of a specific intended institution. Parliamentarism exists today as a method of government and a political system. So it's a method of government and a political system. Just as everything else that exists and functions terribly, it is useful, no more, no less. It counts for a great deal. It counts for a great deal that even today it functions better than the oft other untried methods, and that a minimum of order that is today actually at hand would be endangered by frivolous experiments. So therefore, prudence would say it's better to keep it. It works much better. Even defectively, that is better than the alternatives, but experiments of this, right? And that therefore, the cost of doing these experiments aren't worth the price. Every reasonable person would concede to such argument, but they do not carry weight in an argument about principles. So therefore, that's true. This is a prudential question. But if we're going to talk about ideas and about principles, no, they don't carry weight. Certainly, no one would be so undemanding that he regards an intellectual foundation or a moral truth as proven by the question of what else. In other words, all specifically parliamentary arrangements and norms receive their meaning first through discussion and openness. So for the point, all of these norms receive their through discussion and openness. This is especially true of the fundamental principle that is still recognized constitutionally, though practically hard still believed in today, that the representative is independent of his constituents and party. It applies to the provisions concerning freedom of speech and the immunity of representatives, the openness of parliament proceedings, and so forth. These arrangements would be unintelligible if the principle of public discussion were no longer believed in, right? It is not as if one could ascribe other principles retrospectively and at will to an institution, and if its hitherto existing foundation collapse, just insert any other substitute argument. In other words, this can't be done. In other words, what about if its principles says, respectively of this, you can't, if it's collapsed, you just can't insert any substitute argument. Certainly, the same institutions can serve different practical purposes and allow various practical justifications. Therefore, same institution can do different practical purposes and therefore allow for various practical justifications. There is a heterogeneity of purposes, shifts in meaning from the practical point of view, and functional changes in practice mean, but there is no heterogeneity of principle. In other words, if we assume with Montesquieu, for example, that the principle of monarchy is honor, when this principle cannot be foisted into democratic republic any more than a monarchy could be founded on the principle of open discussion. Indeed, a feeling for the specificity of principles seemed to have disappeared, and an unlimited substitution has taken its place. In the review by Thomas mentioned above, that is really the basic idea of all the objections he raises to my article. But he does not reveal in any way at all, unfortunately, that he is apparently so what the abundantly so abundant. He does not reveal in any way at all, unfortunately, in what the apparently so abundant new principles of parliamentarian are. He is satisfied in a short sentence to mention only the writings of the speeches of Max Weber, Hugo Price, and Friedrich Neumann in those years from 1917 onward. What did parliamentarism mean to those German liberals and Democrats struggling against the imperial political system? Essentially, and most importantly, it was a means for selecting political leaders, a certain way to overcome political dilettantism and to admit the best and most able to political leadership. Whether parliaments actually possess this capacity to build a political elite has since become very questionable, right? This idea that parliament can do this. Today, one would certainly not think so optimistically about this selection instrument, that parliament is that best way to do this. Many would regard such a hope as already outmoded. And the word illusionary, which Thomas uses against Gezoit, could easily be applied to these German Democrats. What numerous parliaments in various European, non-European states have produced in the way of a political elite of hundreds of successive ministers justify no great optimism. But worse, and destroying almost every hope in a few states, parliamentarism has already produced a situation in which all public business has become an object of spoils and compromise for the parties and their followers. And politics, far from being the concern of an elite, has become despised, the despised business. It is become the despised business, or rather dubious class of persons. In other words, machine politics. This is instead of it being this elevated thing, the new people who come out of the legislative monster, legislative state, are these machine politics who are doing it for money, interest, and things like this, right? So instead of producing an elite, it produces the machine, the political machine, right? For a principled reflection, what is still not decisive? Whoever believes that parliamentarism guarantees the best selection of political leaders remain convinced of that, at least today, not because of idealist beliefs, but rather as a practical technical hypothesis constructed on the English model, intended intended for its application on the continent, which one could reasonably discard if it did not succeed. In other words, the British model of parliamentary debate like this was brought to the continent, and one could disregard it if it didn't apply, right? Did not succeed. Nevertheless, this conviction can also be linked to the belief in discussion and openness, and then it belongs to the principled arguments for parliamentarism. So one is a technical argument, the practical technical, what this English model intended for the continent usually discarded. But then if it's linked to this conviction is also linked to this idea of discussion and openness, right? And then it belongs to principal arguments of this, right? Not the practical technical hypothesis, right? Parliament is in any case only true as long as public discussion is taken seriously and implemented. Discussion here has a particular meaning and does not mean negotiation. It's not merely negotiation, deliberation. Discussion means deliberation. And it's not merely negotiation. It means deliberation. What is discussion about debate about deciding what is to come up here? Deliberation. This is the word I would use in that sense. And discussion is, I think, a better translation would be deliberation. Whoever characterizes every possible kind of deliberation and agreement as parliamentarism and everything else as dictatorship or tyranny, as M.J. Bond does in his The Crisis of European Democracy, and also Richard Thomas in his review mentioned above, avoids the real question. In other words, it's not this either or parliamentary, deliberate as parliamentarianism, every kind of deliberation agreement as parliamentarianism, and everything else is dictatorship or tyranny. It's a false dichotomy, he's saying. At every diplomatic conference, in every Congress of delegates, in every board of directors, deliberation goes on, just as it does between the cabinets of absolute monarchs, between corporations, between Christian and Turk. In other words, there's discussion, there's debate. The modern institution of parliament does not arise from these. One should not dissolve concepts and ignore the specific qualities of discussion. Discussion means an exchange of opinions that is governed by the purpose of persuading one's opponent through argument of truth or justice of something, or allowing itself to be persuaded of something true and just. Gens, in this matter, still instructed by the liberal Burke, puts it well. The characteristic of all representative constitutions, he meant modern parliaments by contrast of corporate representation, or the estates. In other words, corporate bodies represented. In other words, all modern parliaments, right? Is that laws arise out of a conflict of opinions, not of the struggle of interests. So, in other words, it comes not from the struggle of interests, but rather a conflict of opinions. To discuss belong shared convictions as premises, the willingness to be persuaded, willingness to be persuaded, independence of party ties, freedom of independence of party ties, freedom from selfish interests. In other words, this is the willingness to be persuaded. That this is independence of party ties, and also this belongs to shared convictions as premises, the willingness to credit the independence of parties and freedom from selfish interest. Right? Most people today would regard such disinterestedness as scarcely possible. But even this skepticism belongs to the crisis of parliamentarism. The features just mentioned, which still officially belong to a parliamentary constitution, make quite clear that all specifically parliamentary arrangements assume this particular concept of discussion. The universally repeated maxim, for example, that every member of parliament is the representative not of the party but of the whole people, is in no way bound by instructions repeated in Article 21 of the Weimar Constitution, and the recurring guarantees of freedom of speech in public sittings only make sense in terms of a correct understanding of this discussion. By contrast, conduct that is not concerned with discovering what is rationally correct, but with calculating particular interests and the chances of winning, and with carrying these through according to one's own interest is all directed by a sort of speech is also directed by a sort of speeches and declarations. So therefore, he distinguishes between a being persuaded by what is good and beneficial versus done by one's interest, right? A calculation, interest, and winning, a chance of particular interest and chance of winning. Both of these can be done by speech says. But these are not discussions in the specific sense. When two businessmen have agreed after a trade rivalry to talk about mutual business opportunities, both have an eye naturally to their own profits, but they can still arrive at a businessman compromise. Openness is just an in, as openness is just as inappropriate in this kind of deliberation as it is reasonable in real discussion. So openness, and think of interest. You only care for your own interests. Openness, that you're open to other things, is not possible in that business relationship. The goal of business is that your own interest. Okay, the political sphere is about the public good, and this is about the question of public good in that sense, right? The argument is, therefore, in other words, there has been deliberation and compromise, as has already been noted everywhere in the world history. People know that it is better most of the time to tolerate one another than to quarrel, and that a thin settlement is better than a thick lawsuit. That is without a doubt true, but it is not the principle of a specific kind of state or form of government. So yes, it's better to tolerate people, and it's better to get a kind of thin settlement versus a very difficult conflict of law, a lawsuit in that sense, right? This is true, but it's not a principle of this kind of state, right? The situation of parliamentarism is critical today because of the development of modern mass democracy has made argumentative public discussion an empty formality. Many norms of contemporary parliamentary law, above all provisions concerning the independence of representatives and the openness of sessions, function as a result like a superfluous decoration, useless and even embarrassing, as though someone had painted the radiator of a modern critical heating system with red flames in order to give the appearance of blazing fire, right? The parties, which, according to the text of the written constitution, officially do not exist, do not face each other today. Do not do not face each other today discussing opinions, but as social and economic power groups calculating their mutual interest and opportunities for power. And they actually agree compromises and coalitions. They actually agree compromises and coalitions on this basis. The masses are won over through a propaganda apparatus whose maximum effect lies on an appeal to immediate interests and passions. So therefore, there is this. The parliament itself is not this open place of open party, that there's no parties, but rather there's blocks have specific interests, and that they get things done by achieving compromises, right? Otherwise, nothing. No compromises, nothing gets done. And coalitions, coalitions, and they form they form compromises to create majority coalitions to get things what they want. And otherwise, if they make it too different, it becomes impossible, right? And then for the question of election, the masses are run through propaganda, who does appeals to intermediate interests and passion, right? Arguments in the real sense, that is, characters of genuine arguments in the real sense, that is, characteristic of genuine discussion, ceases. In its place, there appears a conscious reckoning of interests and chances for power in the party negotiations. In the treatment of the masses, posterior like, insistent suggestion, or as Walter Lippmann says in his very shrewd, although too psychological, American book, Public Opinion, the symbol appears. The literature on the psychology, technique, and critique of public opinion is today very large. One may therefore well assume as well known today, then it is no longer a question of persuading one's opponent of the truth or justice of an opinion, but rather of winning a majority in order to govern it. Right? What Cavour identified as the great distinction between absolutism and constitutional regimes, that an absolute regime a minister gives order, whereas in a constitutional one he persuades all those whom should obey, must today be meaningless. In other words, Cavour says explicitly, I, as constitutional minister, persuade that I am right. And that is only in this connection, in this famous saying, is meant the worst chamber is still preferable to the best antechamber, right? That's right. Today's parliament itself appears a gigantic antechamber in front of the bureaus and committees of indivisible rulers. It is like a satire if one quotes Bentham today. In Parliament, ideas meet, and contract between ideas gives off sparks and leads to evidence. Who still remembers the time when Prevost Perrault saw the value of parliamentarism or the personal regime of Napoleon III in the in that uh, uh, through the transfer of real power, it forced to the true holders of power to reveal themselves, so that government, as a result of this, always represented the stronger power in a wonderful coordination of appearance and reality, right? This moment, this historical thing of France, right? Prevost and Parador. So this, you know, saw the value of Parliament to allow the real people of power to reveal themselves, so that government, as a result, was always represented by the strongest and the most wonderful coordination of appearance and reality, right? Who still believes this kind of openness? And in Parliament, as its greatest platform, the arguments of Burke, Bentham, Gros, and John Stuart Mill are thus antiquated today. In other words, those numerous definitions of parliamentarism, which one still finds in Anglo-Saxon and French writings, and which are apparently little known in Germany, definitions in which parliamentarism appears as essentially government by discussion, must accordingly count as moldy. Never mind. If someone still believes in parliamentarism, he will at least have to offer new arguments for it. A reference to Francis Newman, Hugo Proust, and Max Weber is no longer sufficient. With all respect to these men, no one today would share their hope that Parliament alone guarantees the education of the political elite. This is like, this idea that Parliament alone creates the education of the elite. This is the idea of that Proust. These guys, they agree with Burke, Bentham, Noyes, and right. Such convictions have in fact been shaken, and that the only and they can only remain standing today as an idealistic belief so long as they can blind themselves to belief in discussion and openness. Therefore, they blind themselves to belief in discussion and openness to alive and well. What has been advanced during the last decade as the new justification for parliamentarism still only asserts that in our time parliamentary functions well, or at least tolerably as useful, or at least tolerably as a useful and even indispensable instrument of social and political technique. So, from a principled argument to a it works argument, right? This is just to affirm it once again a completely plausible kind of observation. But one still has to take an interest in the deeper foundations of something Montesquieu called the principle of the state or the government form, and its specific conviction that belongs to this as the very institution in the belief in Parliament, which once actually existed and which one no longer finds today. In the history of political ideas, there are epochs of great energy and time proclaimed times of motionless status quo. Times proclaimed times of motion. So there's great epochs of great energy and great epochs of status quo. Thus, the epochs of monarchy is at an end when, in a sense, the principle of kingship, of honor, has been lost. If bourgeois king appears who seek to prove their usefulness and utility instead of devotion and honor, right? The bourgeois king seeks to prove his utility and usefulness rather than. So therefore, we went from the old Yachamp regime into the bourgeois regime, right? The eternal apparatus of monarchical institutions can remain standing very long. The can remain standing very long, very much long. The external apparatus of monarchical institution can remain standing very much longer after that. But in spite of it, monarchy's hour has told, it's not longer. The convictions inherent in this and no other institution then appeared inadequate. The conviction inherent to this and no other institution then appeared antiquated. Practical justification for it will not be lacking. But it is only an empirical question whether man or organizations come forward who can prove themselves just as useful or even more so than these kings. And though this simple fact brushes aside monarchy, through this simple fact brush aside monarchy. In other words, this question, this is only this, but then someone comes up there and monarchy completely useful. These things are more useful than this. The same old truths for the social technical justification of Parliament. If Parliament should change from an instrument of evident truth to the simple practical technical means, then it only has to be shown via fact, through some kind of experience, not even necessary through an open, self-declared dictatorship, that things could otherwise in Parliament can be otherwise and Parliament is finished, right? If it's only these technical thing and that, other than that, it's therefore, if it's not based, only way you can save parliamentarianism is by principled, this view of openness and discussion, right? But we don't believe it anymore, and that the only thing we have is practical things. But the problem with the practical thing is not a principled thing. That second, that there is evidence that shows it's no longer useful and beneficial. Other things can be useful and beneficial. Then it loses. Okay, I think this is this leads into the question of this really is useful to understand legitimacy. This whole concern about legitimacy of the democratic parliamentary model as opposed to the administrative state and its legality and legitimacy, right? The belief in parliamentarism and government by discussion belongs to the intellectual world of liberalism. It does not belong to democracy. Both liberalism and democracy have to be distinguished from one another, so that the patchwork picture that makes up modern mass democracy can be recognized. Every actual democracy rests on the principle that not only are equals equal, but unequals will not be treated, equals will not be treated equally, but that unequals will not be treated equally. Democracy requires, therefore, first homogeneity, and second, if the need arises, elimination or eradication of heterogeneity. This is an article, I quoted this in my book, my dissertation, and also in my LSU book. It's a great line. Democracy, the problem here is that democracy requires first homogeneity, and second, the need, elimination, or the eradication of heterogeneity. To illustrate this principle, it is sufficient to name two different examples of modern democracy. Contemporary Turkey, with its radical expulsion of the Greeks and its reckless Turkish nationalism of the country, and the Australian Commonwealth, which restricts unwanted entrance through an immigration law and other domains, and like other domains, only takes immigrants who conform to the notion of the right type of settler. A democracy demonstrates by political power by knowing how to refuse or keep at bay something foreign and unequal that threatens its homogeneity. The question of equality is precisely one is not the question of equality is precisely not one of abstract logical arithmetical games. It is about the substance of equality. It can be found in a certain physical and moral qualities, for example, in civic virtue, in arete, the classical definition of virtuous virtue, in the democracy of in the democracy of English sects during the 17th century. Equality was based on a consensus of religious conviction. You're all Protestants, right? You are governed by the Bible, and we all believe in Jesus, right? This is the equality of the sects, right? Since the 19th century, it has existed above all in membership in a particular nation, in national homogeneity. Equality is only interesting and valuable politically so long as it has substance. And for that reason, at least the possibility and the risk of inequality. In other words, it's only the risk of inequality. In other words, equality and inequality are very important. It's politically, in other words, equality is interesting and valuable politically as long as it has substance. And for this reason, has the potential of risk of inequality. There may be isolated examples, perhaps, of an idyllic case of a community in which relationship itself is sufficient, where each of its inhabitants possess this happy independence equally, and each one is so similar to each other one in other words similar to each every no it says is similar to every other one's physically, psychically, morally, and economically, that a homogeneity without heterogeneity exists, something that was possible in primitive agrarian democracies for a long time in the colonial and or for a long time in colonial states. Finally, one has to say that a democracy, because inequality always belongs to equality, can exclude one part of those governed without ceasing to be a democracy. That until now, people who are in some way completely or particularly without rights and who were restricted from the exercise of political power, let them be called barbarians, uncivilized, atheists, aristocrats, counter-revolutionaries, or even slaves, have belonged to a democracy. This is a very interesting point that equality implies inequality. The democratic equality is not required that every individual. That's a misunderstanding of what equality means politically, he says. Very interesting point here. Neither is the Athenian city a democracy, and neither is the Athenian city democracy nor the British Empire are. In other words, nor neither in the neither in the Athenian city democracy nor in the British Empire are all habits of the state territory politically equal. Of the more than 400 million inhabitants of the British Empire, more than 300 million are not British citizens. If English democracy, universal suffrage, and universal equality is spoken of, then these hundreds of millions in English democracy are just unquestionably ignored, as were slaves in Athenian democracy. Modern imperialism has created countless new government forms, conforming to economic and technical developments, which extended themselves to the same degree that democracy develops within the motherland. Colonies, protectorates, mandates, intervention treaties, and similar forms of dependence make it possible today for a democracy to govern a heterogeneous population without making them citizens, making them dependent upon a democratic state, and at the same time held apart from the state. That is the political and constitutional meaning of a nice formula. The colonists are foreign in public law, but domestic in international law. Current usage, that is the vocabulary of the Anglo-Saxon world press, which Richard Thomas submits to and even accepts as a standard for the theoretical definition, ignores all of that. For him, apparently every state in which universal and equal voting rights are made, the foundation of the whole is a democracy. Does the British Empire have universal and equal voting rights of all of its inhabitants? It could not survive a week on these foundations. With their terrible majority, the colored would dominate the whites. But in spite of that, the British Empire is democracy. The same applies to France and all other powers, right? Universal and equal suffrage is only, quite reasonably, the consequence of a substantial equality within a circle of equals, and does not exceed this equality. Now, this is very important. Universal and equal suffrage only comes because there's a consequence of a substantive equality within a certain circle of equals. Does not exceed this. Equal rights make good sense when homogeneity exists. But the current usage of universal suffrage applies to something else. Every adult person, simply as a person, should go ipso be politically equal to every other person. Ipso, ipso means on the face. This is a liberal, not a democratic idea. It replaced formerly existing democracies based on a substantial equality and homogeneity with a democracy of mankind. So therefore, instead of a people, in other words, this liberal thing has created a different situation. That there was a given city, a form based on a substantive equal homogeneity with a democracy of mankind. The democracy of mankind does not exist anywhere in the world today. If for no other reason that because the earth is divided into states, and indeed mostly into national homogeneous states, which try to develop democracy internally on the basis of homogeneity, in which, besides that, there is no way to treat every person as an equally entitled citizen. Even a democratic state, let us say the United States of America, is far from allowing foreigners to share its power or its wealth. Until now, there has never been a democracy that did not recognize the concept foreign, and that could have realized the equality of all men. In other words, you could not, if you have foreigners, you can't have equality of all men. If one were serious about a democracy of mankind and really wanted to make every person the equal politically for every other person, then that would be an equality in which every person took part in a consequence of birth or age and nothing else. Equality would have been robbed of its value and substance because the specific meaning that it has had that it has as political equality, economic equality, and so forth. In short, an equality in a particular sphere would have been taken away. Every sphere that has specific equality and inequalities, every sphere has specific equalities and inequalities. In fact, every sphere, equalities and inequalities. However great an injustice it would be not to respect the human worth of every individual, it would nevertheless be irresponsible stupidity, leading to worse chaos, and therefore even worse injustice if the specific characteristics of various spheres were not recognized. So yes, it would be said that it would be a great injustice not to respect the individual for everything, but it would be even a more irresponsible stupidity, leading to the worst chaos, and therefore even the worst injustice, if the specific characteristics of each various sphere were not recognized. In the domain of the political, people do not face each other as abstractions, but as politically interested and politically determined persons, as citizens, governor and governed, politically allied or opponent, in any case, therefore, in political categories. In the sphere of the political, one cannot abstract out what is political, leaving only the universal human equality. The same applies in the realm of economics, where people are not conceived as such, but as producers, consumers, and so forth. That is, in specific economic categories. Absolute human equality then would be an equality understood only in terms of itself and without risk. It would be an equality without the necessary correlate of inequality. And as a result, conceptually and practically meaning an indifferent equality. So in other words, it's not. In other words, absolute human equality would become meaningless. It would be practically meaningless, and therefore, because it's an indifferent equality. Now, such equality certainly does not exist anywhere, so long as the various states of the earth, as was said above, distinguish as citizens politically from other persons and exclude politically dependent populations that are unwanted or whatever grounds by combining dependence in international law with the definition of such populations alien in public law. In contrast, it appears that, at least inside the different modern democratic states, universal human equality has been established, although there is also although there is, of course, no absolute equality of all persons, since foreigners and aliens remain excluded, and there is nevertheless a relative far-reaching human equality among the citizenry. But it must be noted that in this case, national homogeneity is usually that much more strongly emphasized, and that general human equality is once again neutralized through the definitive exclusion of all those who do not belong to the state, of those who remain outside of it. Where that is not the case, where a state wants to establish general human equality in the political sphere without concern for national or some other sort of homogeneity, then it cannot escape the consequences that political equality will be devalued to the extent that it approximates absolute human equality. In other words, this equality itself is going to devaluate. We cannot escape the consequences that it will be devalued to the extent that it approximates this human equality. And not only that, the sphere of the political and therefore politics itself would be devalued in at least the same degree and would become something insignificant. One would not only have robbed political equality of its substance and made it meaningless for individual equals, but politics also have become insubstantial to the extent that such an indifferent equality is taken seriously. Matters that are dealt with by methods of an empty equality would also become insignificant. Substantive inequalities would in no way disappear from the world and the state. They would shift from into another sphere, perhaps separated from the political and concentrated in the economic, leaving this area to take on a new, disproportionately decisive importance. Under conditions of superficial political equality, another sphere in which substantial inequalities prevail, today, for example, an economic sphere, will dominate politics. This is completely unavoidable, and any reflection on political theory recognizes it as the real grounds for much deplored dominance of economics over state and politics. Wherever an indifferent concept of equality, without without the necessary correlate of inequality, actually takes hold of an area of human life, then this area loses its substance and it's overshadowed by another sphere in which inequality then comes into play with ruthless power. The equality of all persons is not of all persons as person is not democracy, but a certain kind of liberalism, not a state form, but an individualistic humanitarian ethic, worldview, a Weltanschauung, a worldview, and where a humanitarian ethic or worldview. Modern mass democracy rests on confused combination of both. Right? Mass is confused as humanitarianism. Despite all the works of Rousseau, and despite the correct realization that Rousseau stands at the beginning of modern democracy, It still seems to have gone unnoticed that the theory of the state set out in do contract social contract contains these two different elements incoherently next to each other. The facade is liberal. The state legitimacy is justified by free contract. But the substantive disposition and the development of the central concept, the general will, demonstrate that a true state, according to Rousseau, only exists when the people are so homogeneous that there is essential unanimity. According to the contract social, the social contract, there can be no parties in the state, no special interests, no religion difference, nothing that can divide persons, not even a public financial concern. This philosopher of modern democracy, respected by significant national economists such as Alfred Weber and Carl Brinkmann, say in all seriousness, finance is something for slaves, the activity of slaves, right? It should be noticed that for Rousseau, the word slave has an entirely consequential. This slave has an entirely consequential meaning attained in the construction of the democratic state. It signifies those who do not belong to the people, an unequal, and the alien or a non-citizen who is not helped by the fact that in abstractio he's a person. The heterogeneous who does not participate in the general homogeneity and therefore and is therefore rightly excluded from it. According to Rousseau, this unanimity must go so far as the law comes into existence without discussion, sound discussion. Uh, um, Even judges and parties in a suit must want the same, whereby it is never even asked which of these two parties, the accused or the accuser, wants the same. In short, homogeneity elevates into an identity understands itself completely from itself. But if unanimity and agreement of all wills with one another is really so great, then why must another contract be concluded or even construed, right? A contract assumes differences in opinions. Unanimity, just like the general will, is either there or it not. And it may be, as Alfred Weber has accurately pointed out, naturally present, right? There, where it exists, where it exists, a contract is meaningless. So when there's agreement there, there's no need for a contract. Where it does not exist, a contract does not help. The idea of a free contract of all with all comes from a completely different theoretical world where opposing interests, different egoisms are assumed. In this idea comes from liberalism. The general will, as Rousseau constructs it, it is in truth homogeneity. That is a really consequential democracy. According to the social contract, the state therefore rests not on a contract, but essentially a homogeneity, in spite of its title, and in spite of the dominant contract theory. Democratic identity of the governed and the governing arise from that. The state theory of the contract social, the social contract, has proved that democracy is correctly defined as the identity of the governed and governing. When it had been noticed, this definition, which appears in my Political Theology 1922, and the article on parliamentarism, which was partly rejected and partly taken over. Here, I would like to mention that while its application to contemporary state theory and its extension to a new range of identities are new, it is ultimately an ancient one. It is ultimately an ancient. One can even say classical definition that conforms to a tradition that is, for these reasons, no longer well known. So therefore, he says that it is In other words, democracy defined by an identity and governing. Is proof that democracy is correctly defined identity for governing and identity of the governing government. Now he says that notice this definition of this. It was partially rejected, partially taken over. Here, I'd like to mention that while its application to contemporary state theory and its extension to a new range of identities are new, it is ancient, right? It is ultimately an ancient, one could even say classical definition, that conforms to a tradition that is, for these reasons, no longer well known, because it is referenced today to interesting and particular urgent consequences of public law. Pufendorf's formulation should be quoted. In other words, Pufendorf's famous thing should be quoted about this, the formulation of law. In a democracy where those who command and those who obey are identical, the sovereign is an assembly composed of all citizens, can change laws and change constitutions at will. In a monarchy or aristocracy, there are some who command and some who are commanded. A mutual contract is possible, according to Pufendorf, and thus also a limitation of state power. In other words, those contracts can be therefore limiting. But in the people where everyone is there, in the assembly of everyone there, notice this is a particular presentation sees parliamentarism in the middle today, threatened from both sides by Bolshevism and fascism. That is a simple but superficial constellation. The crisis of parliamentarian system and the parliamentary institutions, in fact, spring from the circumstances of mass democracy itself. These lead first to all a crisis. In other words, this leads first of all to a crisis of democracy itself, because the problem of a substantial equality and homogeneity, which is a necessity to democracy, cannot be resolved by the general equality of mankind. This leads further to a crisis of parliamentarism that must be, in other words, first of all, the crisis of democracy, because democracy requires what? The equality democracy requires substantive equality and homogeneity. But the problem with this is that this is denied. This is not resolved by the general equality of mankind. That this does not make it, and therefore this leads to the crisis of. It leads further to the crisis of parliamentarism that must certainly be distinguished from the crisis of democracy. There's two things: the crisis of democracy and the crisis of parliamentarism. Both of these things happening at the same time. Both crises have appeared today at the same time, and each one can aggravate the other, but they are conceptually and in reality different. So they're not one thing. This is why the title. This is why I don't like the title by Kathleen Kelly, and that's Kennedy. Here, Kennedy, Ellen Kennedy. Sorry, Ellen Kennedy. Kathleen. I wanted Kathleen. And that is that the crisis of parliamentary democracy. No, it's the crisis of parliaments and democracy. Right? As democracy, modern mass democracy attempts to realize an identity of governing, and thus it confronts parliament as an inconceivable and outmoded institution, right? So democracy, because it's doing mass democracy, this is parliament as an outmoded institution. If democratic identity is taken seriously, then in an emergency, no other constitutional institution can withstand the old criterion of the people's will, however it is expressed. Against the will of the people, especially an institution based on discussion by independent representatives, has no autonomous justification for its existence. Even less so because of the belief in discussion is not democratic, but originally liberal. Today, one can distinguish three crises. The crisis of democracy, and J.M. Bond directs his attention to this without noticing the contradiction between liberal notions of human equality and democratic homogeneity. Further, a crisis of the modern state by Alfred Weber, Max Weber's brother, right? And finally, the crisis of parliamentarism. The crisis of parliamentarism presented here rests on the fact that democracy and liberalism could be allied to each other for a time, just as socialism and democracy had been allied. But as soon as it achieves power, liberal democracy must decide between its elements, and just as social democracy, which is finally, in fact, in fact, a social liberal democracy. Insofar as modern mass democracy contains essentially liberal elements, it must also contains, in other words, must also decide. In democracy, there are only the equals of equals, and those who belong to the equals. All other institutions will transform themselves into insubstantial social technical expedients that are not in a position to oppose the will of the people, however expressed, with their own values and their own principles. The crisis of the modern state arises from the fact that no state can realize mass democracy, a democracy of mankind, not even a democratic state. With mass this idea of Bolshevism and fascism, by contrast, are, like all dictatorships, essentially anti-liberal but not necessarily anti-democratic. In the history of democracy, there has been numerous dictatorships, Caesarisms, and more strikingly forms that have tried to create homogeneity and to shape the will of the people with methods uncommon in a liberal tradition of the past century. This effort belongs to the undemocratic conception, resulting from a blend of liberal principles in the 19th century that a people could only express its will when each citizen voted in deep secrecy in complete isolation, that is, without leaving the sphere of the private and irresponsible, under protective arrangements and unobserved, which required by Reich voting law in Germany, right? Then every single vote was registered and had arithmetical majority was calculated. Quite elementary rules thus have been lost and are apparently unknown in contemporary political theory, right? Yes, that is it. Quite elementary truths have been quite lost and are apparently unknown in contemporary political. This is a great text. The people is a concept of public law. The people existed only in the sphere of publicity. The unanimous opinion of 100 million private persons is neither a will of the people nor public opinion. The will of the people can be expressed just as well and perhaps better through acclamation, though something taken for granted, an obvious and unchallenged practice. That though the statistical apparatus that has been constructed with such meticulousness in the last 50 years. The stronger the power of democratic feelings, the more certain is the awareness that democracy is something other than the registration system for secret ballots, right? Compared to a democracy that is direct, not only not only in a theoretical sense, but also in a vital sense, democracy appears an artificial machinery produced by liberal reasoning, while dictatorial and the Caesaric methods may not only can produce the acclamation of the people, but also can be direct expressions of democratic substance and power. Even if Bolshevism is suppressed and fascism held at bay, the crisis of contemporary parliamentarism would not be overcome in the least. That's why it's continued. In other words, this crisis of this is the lot. For it has not appeared as a result of the appearance of those two opponents. It was there before them and will persist after them. Rather, the crisis springs from the consequence of modern mass democracy, and in the final analysis, from the contradiction of the liberal individualism burdened by the moral pathos and democratic sentiment governed essentially by political ideas. A century of historic alliance and common struggle against oral absolutism had obscured the awareness of that contradiction. But the crisis unfolds today even more strikingly, and no cosmopolitan rhetoric can prevent or eliminate it. It is in the depths an inescapable contradiction of liberal individualism and democratic homogeneity. Here we end the preface. Well, that was long. I'm going to stop here. You please have your comments. Please put them below. If you have any comments or questions or concerns, please put them below. This is a very powerful thing. You can see how Schmitt gets to the heart of the problems. Of this is not one problem, but this is three problems of the state of democracy and also parliamentarism. He shows how the modern parliamentary system worked with both democracy and parliamentarism. That is a contradiction. That the parliamentarism is in representative government is liberal. If it's understood in this parliamentarian idea as liberal, it's a liberal kind of idea of this. And whereas democracy is the will of the people. What is the will of the people? Equality. Now he goes into this idea of whether there's human equality per se, and how this other human equality destroys any kind of attempt at human democracy of humanity would always lead to a meaninglessness. It would lead to the destruction of the state, the parliamentary. It becomes, in other words, this kind of human rights democracy ultimately. This democracy that seeks to get universal equality ultimately becomes meaningless, and therefore democracy, parliament has no legitimate aspect of it, and therefore it's something that's. And I think this would goes into this idea that such a state would eventually lead to a more likely not as a parliamentary body, but rather a parliamentary state, a legislative state, but rather what he would say an administrative state. Right, that's the whole point. Well, if you have any comments or questions, please put them below. Like it, like it, like it. Share it with a friend. Share it on social media. Hit the like button, please, because it helps bring channel. If you didn't like it, okay, hit the dislike button, but say why in the comments. Another thing you can do is if you have not subscribed, subscribe. Because you get notifications from this, it'll help grow the channel. In this sense, that's going to be a good thing I want to do. Another thing we're going to do is well, okay, subscribe and help the growth. We're on the low 300s, well, 310s, going about 320 soon, I hope. We're at that verge, right? Breaking 320. Oh my God! I like to throw a party. I like to throw an e-party on 300, right? Oh, 300, yeah. Another thing I need to do is, you want to follow me on social media, the social media links are below. If you want to know more about my academic research and about me as a scholar, you can follow my academic social media links below. And then if you want to help me do what I do, you can do so by or you want to help me financially, give a little money to help me do it, you can do so by becoming a member, becoming a Patreon on Patreon, or a contributor on Subscribestar that will be able to send me like a buck, $5 a month, something like that. If you're willing to do such a thing. Well, that's the kind of thing you do. The other thing you do is buy one of my books. The book links are below. They're available at all the major online bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, so forth. And if you want to buy the Lulu book, buy it by Lulu. Why? Because Amazon other bookstores get profit. They make money from it. I no nothing wrong with that. But if you buy by Lulu, I get the money that Amazon wouldn't get. Okay, so that's why I would recommend if you're going to do that, buy it for a student or friend or someone who may be interested in these things. Well, that's it. We're going to stop here. I'm at my end of my thing. Well, take care. Have a good day. Take care. See you again. This is going to be the Schmitt things are going to be Tuesdays and Thursdays. So we'll turn next week. But next issue we'll be looking at the introduction to the original book, the 23 book, because this is the preface of today was 26, the edition, second edition. So we'll stop there. Take care. Bye bye. Have a good day.